Trevor Morrison sat alone in his penthouse, the city's skyline glittering beneath him. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "Everything you've built will burn." His fingers trembled for a brief moment as he read it again, trying to find some logic, some familiar voice behind the cryptic words. But there was nothing. No sender. No clue. A chill ran down his spine. Trevor was used to threats. Hell, he'd dealt with more than his fair share. But this felt different. The silence that followed the message was oppressive, heavy with the weight of something he couldn't yet understand. The world he had spent years constructing was teetering on the edge, and he could feel it, the ground slipping away beneath him. Trevor had everything: money, power, influence, but he also knew the price. Every empire had a weakness, a flaw just waiting to be exploited. He had been careful, methodical. Or so he thought. Who would dare challenge him now, and why? The message was just the beginning. A warning? A declaration of war? Trevor didn't know, but he couldn't afford to wait and find out. Something, or someone, was coming for him, and the question gnawed at him. Was it someone from his past, or someone who knew far too much about the present? Trevor Morrison had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way to the pinnacle of power with cold determination. Now, at the top, he was untouchable. Or so he believed. He stood in his penthouse, the panoramic windows offering a breathtaking view of the sprawling city below. The skyline sparkled like diamonds, a symbol of everything Trevor had achieved. He was a king in his own right, with vast financial holdings, political influence, and a network of loyal allies who answered to him. He had it all: private jets, luxurious mansions, designer suits, and a life many envied. He smiled at the reflection of his perfect life. He had carefully curated every detail. No one could touch him. His fingers drummed on the armrest of his leather chair, the subtle movements betraying the restlessness that occasionally gnawed at him. The world bowed at his feet, but Trevor knew better than to trust it completely. His success wasn't built on trust. It was built on manipulation, leverage, and deals made in the shadows. Politicians were puppets in his hands, easily swayed by his wealth and promises. And then there was Eleanor. She was a rare breed, intelligent, ambitious, and undeniably captivating. She had been his lover for years, but she was more than that. Eleanor was Trevor's closest ally, his co-conspirator in nearly every illicit venture. They shared a bond that went beyond mere affection. She had helped him shape his empire, guiding him through the murky waters of corporate espionage and political corruption. But Trevor was careful not to let her too close. Even with all her brilliance, Eleanor had a tendency to ask questions that Trevor was not yet ready to answer, questions about his past, about things he would rather forget, and he had plenty to hide. Beneath the layers of wealth and power, beneath the dazzling exterior, Trevor was haunted by secrets, dark, dangerous truths that had the potential to unravel everything he had built. It was these secrets that kept him awake at night, that made him question whether his empire was truly as secure as it seemed. His grip on power was tight, but it was fragile, and Trevor knew that better than anyone. The idea had been simple, elegant in its execution. Trevor and Eleanor sat together late one night in a dimly lit hotel suite, the glow of the city skyline outside casting long shadows over the room. They had always been meticulous planners, and this time would be no different. They had already run through the details 100 times, ensuring no loose ends, no room for error. The target was Thomas Baker, Eleanor's estranged husband, a wealthy businessman with too many connections, too much influence. He had become a liability. Someone who threatened to expose everything. Thomas had been a stumbling block in their shared ambitions, an obstacle they could no longer afford. Eleanor's cold, calculating gaze never wavered as she outlined the plan. She and Trevor had spent weeks tracking Baker's movements, learning his habits, and identifying his vulnerabilities. Trevor listened intently, nodding in agreement. He had handled problems like this before, more times than he cared to admit. Removing Thomas Baker would be clean, efficient. Trevor was the master of such things, knowing exactly how to manipulate circumstances so that it appeared like an unfortunate accident. A car crash, a heart attack, a random mugging gone wrong. They had 100 ways to ensure that Thomas would never pose a threat again. But it wasn't just about eliminating Thomas. It was about securing their future. With him out of the picture, Eleanor would inherit the sprawling empire Thomas had built, and Trevor would gain the full freedom to expand his influence. Together, they would reign. Once he's gone, Trevor said, we can control everything. No one will stand in our way. Eleanor's lips curled into a smile, but her eyes remained sharp, calculating. They both knew that the plan wasn't just a business transaction, it was personal. Thomas had hurt her, betrayed her in ways that Trevor could never understand, but Trevor didn't need to understand the emotions behind it. He only needed to know the plan would work. They set the wheels in motion. The money was funneled to the right people, each one unaware of the larger plot they were part of. The timing was perfect. Everything was lined up. Nothing could go wrong. But even as Trevor reveled in the beauty of their orchestration, a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way Eleanor's smile had never quite reached her eyes, or the hesitation in her voice when she discussed certain aspects of the plan. Trevor brushed it off. After all, he had handled worse. He couldn't shake the feeling, though. Something was off. It was a slight discomfort, the kind that only those who had walked through darkness could recognize. But Trevor Morrison had a gift for ignoring such things. This was the moment that would define their legacy. It was supposed to be clean, a quiet removal of a problem. No one would ever know. But Trevor soon learned how quickly things could unravel. The first sign of trouble came in the early hours of the morning, when a video, grainy, shaky, but undeniably damning, began to spread like wildfire across the internet. It was a conversation between Trevor and Eleanor captured from a hidden camera inside their private meeting room. The video showed them discussing the murder of Thomas Baker, their voices low but unmistakable. Their words were a chilling confirmation of the plan that had been set in motion. Social media exploded almost immediately. Users flooded every platform with hashtags, speculations, and condemnations. News outlets caught wind of the video and began broadcasting it in looped segments, their anchors staring into the cameras with a mix of shock and disbelief. The story was everywhere. Panic gripped Trevor. His phone rang nonstop, messages flooding in from allies, enemies, and journalists alike. He tried to shut it down, but the damage was already done. The video was too widespread, too damning. His empire was crumbling in real time, and Trevor could do little more than watch as the pieces fell. Eleanor, ever the strategist, was nowhere to be found. Trevor's mind raced. Had she leaked the video herself, or was this someone else's doing? Had someone figured out their plan, or was this the work of someone closer? Someone within their circle? Trevor tried to maintain control, calling in favors, demanding damage control. But it wasn't enough. The story had broken wide open, and there was no stopping it now. As the news reporters swarmed outside his penthouse, microphones and cameras thrust in his face, Trevor understood one horrifying truth. The narrative was no longer his to control. He turned to his trusted team, barking orders, but the look in their eyes told him everything. There was fear there, fear that they weren't sure how far the fallout would go. And then there was something else. A quiet understanding that no amount of money or power could fix this. Eleanor's absence only made it worse. Where was she? Why wasn't she here, beside him, as they had always been before? Trevor's mind raced again, this time with darker possibilities. Had she turned on him? Or had something gone horribly wrong? In the middle of the chaos, as his phone buzzed yet again, Trevor saw the headline flash across his screen. Billionaire Trevor Morrison and alleged co-conspirator Eleanor Baker caught in murder plot. The fallout had begun, and it was only just starting. The descent was faster than Trevor could have imagined. One moment, he was standing at the pinnacle, untouchable, and the next, he was being dragged into the depths of his own downfall. The first blow came when he tried to access his offshore accounts, his last bastion of financial security. Every login attempt was met with an impenetrable barrier. His funds were frozen, locked by a series of intricate codes and legal roadblocks. Someone had moved faster than he could anticipate, dismantling his entire financial network. The billions that had once been his safety net were gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. Desperation twisted in his gut as the reality of his situation set in. One by one, his loyal employees turned on him. The men and women who had once bowed to his every command were suddenly emboldened. Whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire within his company's walls. They knew he was finished. The higher-ups who had once been his closest allies were now rushing to cut ties, distancing themselves from the wreckage he had become. His empire was crumbling, and there was no one left to help him. By the time the FBI arrived, Trevor had already started to mentally prepare for what was coming. But even then, the scene was poetic in its irony. He stood by the massive windows of his penthouse, watching the flashing lights of the black SUVs below as they pulled up to his building. Agents flooded the lobby, their steps heavy and purposeful. Trevor had spent years surrounding himself with the finest lawyers, the best legal defenses money could buy, and yet here they were, at his doorstep. He had once stood as a man of power, a symbol of unassailable wealth, but now he was a man marked for destruction. "Mr. Morrison," an agent said, stepping forward with a stern expression, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The words hit him harder than he expected. There was no room for defiance, no clever escape. His world had turned to ashes, and he was powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, Eleanor's world was disintegrating just as quickly. The glamorous life she had built with Trevor was no more. Her clients, once loyal and seeking her counsel, pulled back in droves. Reputation was everything in her world, and hers was now irrevocably shattered. News outlets painted her as an accomplice in a murder plot, and the public was unforgiving. She had always prided herself on her control, but now that control had slipped from her grasp, leaving nothing but panic in its wake. Desperation clouded her every thought as her phone rang incessantly. Calls from former allies turned into insults. Invitations to meetings became threats. Her phones were hacked, her emails intercepted. The elegant veneer she had so carefully crafted was peeling away, and beneath it was the raw truth. She had nowhere to run. As the walls closed in on them both, Trevor and Eleanor clung to the one thing they had left: their denial. Trevor still insisted he could fix this, that he could escape the noose tightening around his neck. Eleanor tried to convince herself that the world would come around, that they would find a way out of this mess. But deep down, they both knew the truth. The collapse was inevitable. Thomas Baker was alive. No one had expected it, not Trevor, not Eleanor, and certainly not anyone watching the chaos unfold from the outside. But Thomas had survived the plot against him. He had always known it would come to this. He had been watching them for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the media and authorities hounded Trevor and Eleanor, Thomas remained in the shadows, a ghost in the system. His life now was a far cry from the world he had once known. A former military operative with a background in covert operations, Thomas had always lived quietly, blending in with the ordinary masses. But there was nothing ordinary about him. His training, his experience in the darkest corners of the world had made him a master of survival. The plan to destroy Trevor's empire had been his idea from the beginning. He knew Trevor's vulnerabilities better than anyone. He had survived the murder attempt, vanishing without a trace, and began his quiet, meticulous revenge. With the help of Matteo, a hacker and former intelligence officer with connections to some of the most sophisticated cyber networks, Thomas had begun to dismantle Trevor's empire. Matteo was a quiet, unassuming figure, the kind of man who could slip into any digital network unnoticed. His skills were unparalleled, and together with Thomas's precise tactics, they had begun to strike at the heart of Trevor's empire. Matteo's work had started with the offshore accounts, locking down every asset, freezing every account. It was only the beginning. They had infiltrated Trevor's financial networks, exposed his secrets, and manipulated the system to ensure that Trevor's empire would crumble from within. Every step of the plan had been executed flawlessly. But Thomas had more in mind than just financial destruction. He wanted to break Trevor and Eleanor in every way possible, to watch them unravel as they had once done to him. As he watched the headlines, he couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Trevor, the man who had destroyed so many lives without a second thought, was now watching his own life implode. Matteo, sitting beside him in a small, dimly lit room, looked over at his ally. "It's almost time," he said quietly. "They'll break soon." Thomas nodded. He knew it was true. The walls were closing in on Trevor and Eleanor, but there was still more to come. They had underestimated him, and now it was his turn to watch their downfall. The trap was set, and Thomas Baker was watching everything unfold from the shadows he had chosen, waiting for the final act to play out. Tom didn't seek revenge with rage or chaos. He orchestrated it like a symphony, every note planned, every crescendo timed to strike at the heart of Trevor Morrison's empire. The first move was financial. Mateo had wormed his way into Morrison Global's internal networks, subtly redirecting funds, exposing shell companies, and leaking tax evasion files to international authorities. Overnight, regulators froze accounts and launched investigations on multiple continents. Investors panicked, stockholders bailed, and Trevor's financial empire began to hemorrhage money. Then came the evidence. Through encrypted channels, Tom began to release carefully curated pieces of information, emails, voice memos, ledger scans, each one linking Trevor to a long list of illicit deals. Corrupt politicians who had once bowed to Trevor now scrambled to deny association. Several turned state witness in exchange for immunity. Even long-trusted lieutenants within Trevor's own organization flipped, each testimony chipping away at the illusion of invincibility. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat in a cold, gray prison cell, her power, beauty, and charm rendered meaningless within the concrete walls. She still believed she could manipulate her way out, still thought Trevor would find a way to free her. But days passed, then weeks. Her calls went unanswered, her legal team slowly disbanded, and her name was now synonymous with scandal and betrayal. What haunted her most, though, was the feeling that someone else was pulling the strings, that this downfall wasn't Trevor's failure alone, but part of something much bigger, and she had no idea who. Back in court, Trevor entered like a man clinging to an identity that no longer existed. His tailored suits and silver tongue couldn't hide the growing panic in his eyes. The courtroom was a theater of his undoing. Documents, audio recordings, and faces from his past took the stand, each a dagger to the myth he'd built. His once loyal CFO recounted every bribe. A former senator described private meetings in hushed tones. Even a bodyguard confessed to cleaning up inconvenient messes. Then came the final blow. An anonymous digital witness submitted a dossier linking Trevor to a crime never before revealed, one so buried even Trevor had forgotten its loose ends. His face paled, his voice cracked. The courtroom watched, rapt, as the man who once ruled over cities now sat exposed, dismantled by a ghost. By the end of the trial, Trevor was no longer feared. He was a cautionary tale, and Tom, he was far from finished. In the quiet town of Livingston, Montana, the man once known as Thomas Baker now went by James Wilson. He lived in a modest house near the edge of town, nestled beside a slow-moving river and surrounded by pine. His days were simple, restoring antique furniture in a small shop off Main Street, chatting with locals about nothing more than wood grain and stain colors. His hands, once trained to dismantle weapons, now sanded oak with careful precision. But beneath the calm, James remained vigilant. Hidden in the back of his shop was a secure room, a relic from another life. There, encrypted feeds tracked Eleanor's prison location, Trevor's sentencing updates, and the slow, inevitable decline of anyone else who had played a role in what had nearly killed him. Mateo's AI system monitored dark web chatter, financial anomalies, and government leaks. Quietly, steadily, James stayed ahead. He didn't crave the chaos anymore, but he never forgot it. He couldn't. It was part of him, just like the scars that ran across his side and the nightmares that came on cold nights. Living as James Wilson gave him peace, but if peace ever shattered, Thomas Baker would be ready. A low hum of tension echoed through Tom's otherwise peaceful life in Livingston. It began with an anonymous inquiry, a single, cryptic email that landed in Mateo's inbox. Looking for answers. Want to know who's behind the fall of Trevor Morrison? Are you willing to talk? Mateo was quick to analyze the source. It wasn't an ordinary investigator. This was someone with access to the right networks, someone who had the resources to track down the truth. The email was traced back to an associate of Trevor's, a shadowy figure who had quietly observed the wreckage from the sidelines, a former business partner, or perhaps a debt collector turned interested party. Whoever they were, they had begun poking around, asking questions, digging where they shouldn't. Mateo's warning was immediate. Someone's getting close. We need to move fast. The realization hit Tom hard. His past, buried so carefully, was now at risk. It was no longer just about Trevor or Eleanor. This was a new threat. Someone was actively looking for him, hunting the final pieces of his plan. Tom stood in his small workshop, his hands still as he stared at the surveillance feeds. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had come too far to let someone bring it all crumbling down now. The solution was simple, quiet, efficient. The associate would disappear. A subtle shift in the digital world would erase every trace of their existence. One last silent operation to keep the past buried, where it belonged. Tom wasn't a man who left loose ends. By the time they realized the threat was gone, it would be too late. The past would remain exactly that, unfound and forgotten. Trevor Morrison's cell was a far cry from the penthouse he had once called home. The walls, gray and cold, felt like a cage around him. His mind, once sharp and calculating, was now fractured by the weight of his downfall. He muttered to himself in the dark, speaking of revenge, of reclaiming what was lost. But the prison walls kept him grounded in the brutal truth. His empire was gone, and the man who had destroyed it was still out there. Eleanor's mind fared little better. The isolation of her cell gnawed at her sanity, her once pristine beauty fading into a pale, worn version of itself. She spent her days in paranoid silence, haunted by the whispers of the world outside. Every sound in the hallway, every shift in the air, seemed to signal a threat. Was it a guard, a fellow inmate, or was someone else coming for her? Someone she could no longer control? The truth of her involvement in the plot had crushed her reputation, but it was the relentless fear of what had truly happened to Tom that consumed her thoughts. She feared him more than she feared the prison itself. The greatest punishment they faced wasn't the walls that confined them. It was the knowledge that somewhere out there, Thomas Baker, James Wilson, was free, living his life, watching from afar. A man they had underestimated, a man who had outsmarted them at every turn. He had won, and they knew it, and that knowledge would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom locked up the doors of his small workshop with deliberate care, each motion slow and precise. He turned the key in the lock, securing the building with the same methodical attention he had applied to every detail of his life. The soft click of the lock echoed in the silence of the room, signaling the end of another day. Inside, the workbench was quiet, the scattered tools neatly set aside. He didn't feel joy nor triumph. There was no satisfaction in this, only the clarity that came from seeing his plans come to fruition. Justice had been served, but it had come at a cost. The past was gone, buried beneath layers of quiet decisions and cold calculations. He reached for the small glass on the counter, poured a bit of bourbon, and raised it to the empty room. No words, just the quiet acknowledgement of what he had accomplished. As he turned to leave, he glanced at the small cameras tucked into the corners of the room, still recording, still watching. He reset them, ensuring they would continue their silent vigil. The door clicked shut behind him. You never truly know the person you betray.